So let's ensure we can fetch places. As I mentioned, definitely try this on your own first if you haven't already. Otherwise, we'll now do it together. First of all, let's have a look at the backend. There we have our places routes, and we got that route which allows us to fetch a place by user ID, which is exactly what we want. Or to be precise, fetch multiple places by user ID. So there we need to send a GET request to this URL. And of course, we want to do that on the user places page. That's the page where we render our places. That's where I currently use the dummy places. I'll comment this out. You could also delete it. Actually, let's delete it to save some space because we're not using the dummy places anymore. Instead, let's now use our custom hook here, the use HTTP client hook from shared hooks HTTP hook. And let's use that to make our HTTP request. So here I will call use HTTP client, and we get back an object which I'll destructure with the isLoading state, the error state, the send request function, and the clear error function. Then here we extract the user ID from the URL, which we definitely need. And thereafter, we want to send our request. And we want to do this only once. So again, I will use useEffect here to ensure that we send the request when this component renders, but not when it re-renders. So here, as a dependency, I will provide send request, which will never be recreated because it's wrapped in use callback. So this will never trigger this function here to re-render. And therefore, this function will only render once when this component is mounted. Now, in this component, I want to manage my loaded places here as a state now, because initially that will be empty, and I want to set it once I got data, and then this component should re-render. So it definitely should be some component state. Loaded places and set loaded places here initially is undefined. Here we can get rid of this line therefore. And now in useEffect, I will call send request, and just as before, I want to use async await, but adding async here is not really something you should do. So I will wrap this into a new function, fetch places. This now can be an async function, and in this function I will use send request from my custom hook, and I will simply call fetch places here now. So send request now can be waited for, so to say, and we'll get our response data here. Now let's have a brief look at the back and what we get there. In the places controller, in get places by user ID, I in the end expect to get my user ID as part of the URL, and then I return in the end an object with a places key with my places. So back on the front end, this will have a places key, or it should have. Let's wrap it in try catch so that we only set our loaded places here if we do have a successful response. So then I will call set loaded places and set this equal to response data.places, because that is that key we are getting on the backend, and this will be an array. So we'll set this here, and otherwise I'll not do anything. Now, the user ID here, of course, is required to send that request. So here I will set up a template literal with backticks so that we can easily inject dynamic data into this string. It, of course, starts, as it always starts, with localhost 5000/API/places. And then, per our backend API definition, it's /user. You can check the backend routes here if you're not sure. /user. And then /the actual user ID. So in my case here, /user/ and then I inject the user ID I get here out of my URL. We want to send a GET request. We need no special headers, so no other argument needs to be passed to send request. However, user ID now also needs to be added as a dependency on the useEffect function here, because, well, we do use user ID in there, but this also won't change as long as we are on the same page with the same user ID in the URL. Obviously, I want to show an error if we got one, and I also want to show a loading state. So just as before, we can import the error modal from shared components, UI elements, error modal, and repeat that step to also import our loading spinner from there. And with these two pieces imported down there, just as we did it before, I will wrap this into React fragments so that we can have multiple root level React elements, or JSX elements, I should say. And then we can render our error modal there, forward any error we might have, like this, and on clear should point at clear error. And if we're loading, I want to show a loading spinner. So if is loading is true, I want to render a div, let's say, with a class name of center to have a nicely centered loading spinner like this here. And last but not least, let's make sure we only show the places here if we are not loading and we do have loaded places. Only in that case, I want to output them. By the way, you could also add a fallback scenario for cases where you have no loaded places. With that, I don't mean that it's an empty array, but that it's undefined for whatever reason. An empty array is handled inside of place list. There we render a fallback if this is empty. So with that, if we save this, we can reload here and we see our places. Now we also see some things wrong with the URL here. I do have an image, but the source is not rendered correctly. So the source is not set correctly here because in place list, I render a place item, I forward the image, and I extract place.image URL for that. Now, I'm storing this differently on the backend. If you check your collections, in places, we do have an image property, not image URL. So actually here, we should retrieve .image and not image URL. If we do that and we go back, we see our images. Now, this is a bit pixelish. We will later, of course, be able to upload our own images, and then we can upload proper images. Other than that, though, it works. And if we view this on a map, this is the marine plots. The image just is wrong because at the moment on the backend, we always use the same dummy image. As I said, later in this app, we'll be able to provide our own ones. Here on the Empire State Building, of course, it's a better fit. And there we point at the Empire State Building. So this is already working. We are able to load places. As a next step, I want to make sure that if I am logged in with the correct user, and I therefore see edit and delete, these two buttons work as well. And I can go to edit and then load the place correctly and edit it and save these changes to the server. And the same, of course, for deleting, that this also works. As before, your chance to try this on your own. Updating, so editing, is probably a bit more challenging. Deleting should be straightforward. In the next lectures, we'll of course do it together though.